So, welcome to Selecting Your Provider Data Automation Partner, our webinar on how disruptive automation does not need to disrupt. And by the end of today, you'll be armed with a three-step framework with the right questions to ask potential vendors when choosing a data automation partner. I'm Jake Tunney, Director of Payer Solutions at Leap Orbit, and I oversee our provider data hub and automation platform Convergent. And I'm joined by David Finney, partner and co-founder of Leap Orbit. Thanks for joining, David. Would you be so kind before we jump in, sort of queuing folks up and giving a little background on Leap Orbit and yourself as well?
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad to. Thanks, Jake, and good to see everybody here on a rainy Friday afternoon from Leap Orbit office in Columbia, Maryland. We started this company in 2015, and it's comprised of a team of interoperability experts who kind of grew up in the health information exchange and clinical interoperability world, but we've expanded since our founding to provide solutions to health plans, provider organizations, government agencies, and other healthcare enterprises in addition to HIEs. And our footprint covers the whole country. The last time we looked at it, we touch over 45 million Americans from all the way over in Alaska to here on the East Coast. So I'm looking forward to talking to everybody. And yeah, Jake, why don't you jump in?
Okay, sounds good. So just before we hop into sort of the framework, in the interest of making sure everyone understands where we're coming from, I just want to give a little bit of context about our product, but really also about the market. And as everyone knows, automation isn't really new to healthcare, but we continue to see an ever-increasing need for automation to help make us more efficient, save our workforce time, especially with staff shortages, and manage the large volumes of data. I think, today we're just seeing reams and reams of data, more than we've ever seen before. So having automation practices is really important. I think it will be clear to you today that we have a really strong point of view on these things. And we're seeing more and more proliferation of things like AI, machine learning. So today we want to make sure you have a good guide to help navigate this environment. And just a little bit about Convergent. Promise today is not a sales pitch. Convergent's the opposite of black box. We take in any type of provider data, rosters, direct contracts, etc., standardize, dedupe, and enrich that data with hundreds of primary sources and share that cleaned up data in an automated way wherever it's needed. And we give complete observability, transparency into how our customers' data is being enriched. So throughout today, I'll be asking the audience a couple questions about their experience with automation, different vendors, and I'll be dropping them in the chat. Feel free to respond there, and we'll sort of use that to help our conversation flow. But for step one of our framework, is your data a black box? Really good question to be asking a vendor, and some other sub-questions that will help identify whether that's the case or not. David, could you kind of walk through why we think this is a really great place to start?
Yeah, sure, Jake. I'll start with maybe a little bit of a story from our experience, which is we had a customer who came to us. They had an existing PDM solution that had been implemented that was feeding provider data downstream to their consumer-facing experience. They were getting a lot of feedback from both consumers and also the providers who were in their network that, hey, this data doesn't look right, it's wrong, where are you getting it from? And so they took that back to their vendor and said, hey, we've compared what we're seeing, what our consumers are complaining about with the rosters that we're receiving from our upstream data sources, and we can't figure out where this data is coming from. What are you doing in the middle? And the vendor couldn't provide them with a good answer. They said, well, algorithms, machine learning, sophisticated stuff, you can trust it. But at the end of the day, the data wasn't right. It wasn't meeting the needs of the folks that were looking at it. And you can have the coolest algorithm in the world, but if you can't explain how it works, or you can't sort of harness it to do what you need, then it's not going to be built for purpose. So we'll talk a little bit about transparency, I think, later in the discussion. But I think that was an instructive lesson for us. And as we've implemented our solution for that particular customer, I think one of the things that makes it really different from what they were doing before is that they've got total transparency into what's happening inside the technology box. And they've even got the ability to make changes or manipulate things on the fly if they need to.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. I really enjoy how through today we're going to be using sort of these case studies to talk to this and sort of the practicality of this framework. And just a little bit more on this slide before we move on. So these questions: how do we trust your data sources? How do you define confidence? When were your sources last updated? And how do we manage variances between your data and ours? These are all questions that I think address the same topic that David's getting at, which is transparency, observability, making sure that instead of a black box, you're working with a glass box so you can completely see into that, where all of the data is getting mastered. So we take sort of a different approach with our product, where instead of saying, our data's the most accurate, which it is very accurate, but asking customers to take a leap of faith based on some of those metrics, we take a different paradigm, which is really creating confidence out of a combination of match rate and context. So match rate is the percentage match between a customer's data set and our data set, and combining that with a customer's data and giving you the complete control and clarity into what data sources are then being used, either customer data sources specific or enrichment data sets that are being brought in. So typically we rely on primary sources to help populate a customer's data set. So the exact source and provenance of that data that's creating that element within the glass box. And just quick aside on machine learning and AI, I don't want to discredit that because there's a lot of great innovation that's happening right now with that. But I think what's important is identifying the use cases where it really can make a difference. So we're seeing great opportunities with AI for help identifying synonyms between specialties where folks, might free text in some version of a specialty that might not be as standardized as what we'd like to use. So that's an example there. And then you can think of things like names and how folks might spell their name differently one day or use a shortened version of their name. But being able to use AI to phonetically match those things, another great use case for AI. David, anything else on this slide before we move on?
Yeah, in the previous slide, we talked about trust and confidence, and I think those are words that are important. There's another word that gets thrown around a lot, which is accuracy. And I think in some ways, getting into arguments about whose data is more accurate is a little bit of a fool's errand. Because the reality is nobody has perfectly accurate data. What matters most is do you have data that's trustworthy, and what is the context in which you're being asked to generate a record? And the context and the provenance are super critical. Roster data tends to have a lot of old, out of date information, but it's the source of truth for certain things. It can be reflective of what's in the network contract. And so from that perspective, it needs to be trusted. And it doesn't mean that you want to overwrite say, a certain service location with another one because it may not be reflective of what's in the contract between the plan and the provider. So I think having the ability to make choices about how the data is presented based on that context is the way that you achieve confidence. If you have a process that's more opaque or more simplistic, then you do end up with the kinds of problems that that people struggle with, which is you're delivering data that's not right for the use case that's at hand.
Absolutely. Yeah. I have nothing to add on that. I appreciate that, David. So let's move on to step number 2 in the framework. I'm kind of thinking of our framework as, well, it's 3 steps, but first step is really around software and sort of the paradigm in which that software was designed. Step number 2 is really around implementation. So let's put this into practice. And I think this is often an overlooked area of managing an automation project. So while I queue up this next question for participants, have you ever been part of a project where the result was delayed and eventually never came to fruition? And what was that like? So feel free to drop that in the chat if you've got experience with that. But David, while I'm doing that, could you perhaps share another sort of case study around this and why we think it's so important?
Yeah, I think provider data related projects are often perceived as very high risk. And I think there are a bunch of reasons for that. One is a lot of organizations have sort of skeletons in their closet with attempts to address this issue in the past that have not gone well. And another reason why they're perceived as high risk is that they touch lots of different pieces of the business in different ways. And someone ends up being disappointed. And so, I think I'll give you an example of a story, that sort of illustrates this. There's a health plan that, that we've engaged with who is in the midst of a 3-year sort of all-encompassing Titanic provider data management implementation with another vendor. And all other decisions in the provider data space have been deferred while this new solution is being implemented. And you can sort of think of it as this like many tentacle thing with lots and lots of different integrations, lots of affected business processes, lots of stakeholders with expectations about how it's going to work. And even some of the key decision makers within that organization say, hey, we know we're going to have problems at the end of that 3 years. To me, that's a recipe for failure, or at least disappointment. And so, one of the ways that you can reduce the risk of your vendor delivering or not delivering is to accelerate the time to value and sort of lower the stakes. So we can talk a little bit more about that, Jake. But what I would say to you is that if a vendor promises you that after a 3-year implementation they're going to solve all your problems, that's a major red flag.
Absolutely. And just a little bit more on the slide before we jump on. A couple of these questions really stand out to me as super useful and maybe not something that you would typically think to ask a software vendor. But what we've seen is having a reliable project management process. We do 2-week sprints. That's something a customer can come to us and say, we need these tweaks and these changes. Well, using that standardized process that we have across all our projects allows us to plug in these changes into that and have reliability that after that, it's a very quick, iterative, agile process. You're going to get results and you're going to know where that task is in that queue. So again, I think it speaks to sort of the transparency that you should look for with vendors. And part of that too is just speaking with project managers. These are the people that are going to be owning your project going forward. And well, they should be people that you like, um, people that you can ask them tough questions. And if a vendor says, no, I don't think this is the right time, you can speak with them during implementation. To me, that's a red flag. Another thing there too that I think is more of a gut feeling thing that you'll have to balance is how do we know will be a priority? So what we've seen is during a sales cycle, that's really a place that you can read some information from how you're treated. If you're not getting prompt responses to emails, you feel like the process is not moving at your desired pace, that to me could be a red flag as well. And then I think this final question here, how well can you tackle my burning problem, is a great segue to this next slide, David. So let's chat about this big red flag. Beware pilots. Pilots is such a loaded term in our industry. So could you share with me sort of how we think about pilots and um, maybe a different way of framing this?
Yeah, a lot of times pilots are sort of presented as a high stakes test. Hey, why don't you do this thing for me? And if you do it and I grade you an A or an A minus, we might do business with you. Anything less than that, then you've proven that that this isn't going to work. From my perspective, that's a recipe for a challenged relationship. And it's not to say that it isn't good to start small. I actually think it's critical to start small. But the approach that we typically propose is, hey, what's your most burning problem? And what's a problem that that the vendor can achieve in 60 to 90 days of time to value, and not the 3 years that I was talking about before. That's the type of project that can not only sort of reduce the risk of a failure blowing up in somebody's face, but it can also bring on skeptical stakeholders within the organization, build credibility for tackling provider data initiatives across the company, and also just make sure that the relationship is right. So we've tried to take that approach in all of our engagements. Let's start small. Let's make sure that we can deliver for you, and let's make sure that you're happy. And let's make sure that you've got something to show off internally as a quick win that's going to build momentum and build credibility.
Absolutely. And to be candid, we've done pilots before and we've seen this, and this is kind of why we have this opinion. And sort of a typical thing that we've done or in the past, and we know other vendors do this too, is have sort of this data beauty contest where they take a prospect's data, they compare it against theirs, and they say, hey, look how great we can clean this up. And what the prospect or whomever's looking at the vendor sees is a bunch of different variances that, well, they're not really helpful because they don't speak to what David was mentioning is, how is this solving my specific problem? So if we can align smaller projects at the start with addressing more burning problems, initially, you can gain a lot more traction, you gain that credibility faster and gain that rapport with between the two parties. So final question before we go in a few slides to Q&A, and before we jump into our third and final piece of the framework, have you implemented a solution from a vendor that didn't get adopted by your team? And as I'm typing that to put in the chat, David, can I cue you up too to discuss how can we be sure my team is bought in? So we go from data, product, step one, sort of what the software solution is. Step two, ensuring that you can trust that vendor is going to deliver. And then number three, adoption, long-term buy-in. So how do we think about that?
Yeah, I think it's why the idea of implementation and customization is so important. I, People talk about provider data problems, but so often what the real issue is, or the real issues tend to be operational challenges or business process challenges that have a provider data element to them. And so, there's some vendors out there in this space who sort of will wink and nod and say, hey, let us automate your provider data operations, and you're going to be able to eliminate 10 FTEs, and there's cost savings there. And the value proposition is being pitched as human resource reduction. A lot of times that's not the objective of these projects. The real issue is that you've got often highly educated, highly skilled people that are performing sort of low value, repetitive administrative tasks to move provider data around the organization. And what they really want is tools to do their job more effectively, and to add value at the top of their abilities. And so I think really dialing into what those business process improvements are, and understanding what's the toolkit that your team really needs in order to do its job efficiently and well, is that's when we sort of see the light bulb go off, and we see the stakeholders within the health plan organization say, okay, I think this project could be a win for me.
Yeah, and in my experience previously as a consultant, what I really learned and enjoyed doing is working with the people that are a part of healthcare. And I think it comes down to healthcare really is about people and the processes that make up their daily life. And if the user's processes aren't aligned and elevated by a new software solution, you're just not going to see adoption happen. People are going to revert back to old ways, work around the system, and you're not going to get the ROI that you're budgeting and modeling out. And a lot of times, what we've seen too is sort of back to this pilot approach where a vendor says, here's everything that's wrong with your data. That can actually end up with more manual work for resolving those variances, and not thinking through that second and third implication of these change initiatives is really where you can see projects stumble. So yeah, integrating back in that data into the organization in a context specific way is key.
Yeah, Jake, I also think doing the right discovery on the front end to understand what the burning problems are is critical, and kind of starting with the best opportunities. So, there's one customer that we have where we, in the discovery phase, what we learned was, hey, it's really critical for us to keep the provider data in Facets and our member facing tools in sync, so that the doctors that are getting paid are the same doctors that we're representing to be in our network to our members. That's what we focused on. That was the value proposition in the very short term, and we made sure that we delivered on that value proposition. For another customer, it was, hey, our member facing provider search experience stinks, and it's causing issues with network development, and it's causing issues with member surveys. That was a very tangible objective, and one that we could address, and it built credibility among the team there for more provider data work and momentum around other aspects of what's a really multifaceted challenge.
Absolutely. And so what we've kind of created for this part of the framework is this basic equation where we think of buy-in as a factor of collaboration and communication. So this is throughout implementation, but after implementation through the adoption cycle. And part of our implementation is we know that once our product's integrated, there's going to be change orders. That's part of a successful implementation, is looking for new ways to solve problems, and sort of that's where our project managers become consultants, really, to helping identify new opportunities to solve and further automate and further elevate a workforce. So let's hop into Q&A. So feel free to use the webinar chat function to drop any questions here.
Or the Q&A, or the Q&A box, either one will work.
Yes. Yep, I'll be monitoring both of those. And I spoke with some participants leading up to this, with some other questions that I can ask you, David.
Sure.
As we're waiting for folks to filter into the chat. So talk to me a little bit more about what an implementation based around incrementalism looks like, strategic incrementalism. What does that typical project sort of look like?
Yeah, well, just to sort of create the compare and contrast again, I talked earlier in the conversation about the 3-year monolithic implementation, with everybody sort of holding their breath to the end to see how it lands. That's the opposite, in our view, of what you want to do when you try to tackle a problem like this. The question really needs to be, what can we deliver for you within 60 to 90 days that's going to move the value or move the needle in terms of business value? And the answer to that question will be something different at every organization, as I sort of alluded to earlier. If a vendor can't deliver something of meaningful value in 60 to 90 days, then I think you either need to question the vendor, or ask yourself whether you're kind of clearly defining what your business objectives are and what your pain points are. So a lot of that work gets done up front. Sometimes it's very clear to a plan what that issue is. Like there's consensus within an organization that this is something that's got to be fixed, and it's got to be done right away because it's a compliance problem, or there's a new line of business that needs specific support, and whatever it may be. Like from my perspective, hitch a ride on that urgency, and use it to the advantage of your broader objective of automating your provider data operations. You can always do more later, but if you can't be successful in a short-term project, you're not going to be successful over the long term.
Absolutely. And so this is more of a creative question, I think, because CMS is talking about this stuff. We're seeing automation, I think, really proliferate within healthcare. What does this look like 5 years from now? So, based on current trends and what you're seeing, sort of, help us think through that.
Well, I think this is where the other sort of aspects of LeapOrbit's business in the interoperability space they give us a unique perspective. It's pretty wild when you step back and look at it, how many rosters are flying around the healthcare industry in these sort of many-to-many arrangements. And these are all flat files, right? They're CSV files, Excel files, whatever. It's an incredibly inefficient process. Healthcare is full of inefficient processes, but this is one that's sort of breathtaking when you look at it. If you think about the average health plan, whatever that means, it is moving dozens, if not hundreds, of different flat files, and trying to aggregate them in an increasingly rapid turnaround environment into a reliable picture of what their network looks like. And I don't see that being the world that we live in 5 to 7 years from now. There are other mechanisms out there for two different organizations to communicate changes in the status of, say, a set of employed providers at a hospital system that are much more real time and much more efficient and much more reliable. And I think that's where the world's going to go in sort of an API based, message based, publish, subscribe sort of an integration where anytime something changes in the status of a provider who's employed by or affiliated with a provider organization, all the contractual counterparties, the health plans, the ACOs, whatever, will be notified in real time so that their data sets can be updated to reflect that change. That's where I think we're going.
Yeah, I agree. And so I kind of want to put a pin in that because I think there's a sub question to this
Yeah.
about the NDH. But we got a great question from Greg Gordon in the chat. So let me read that to you and then we can chat about that. So from the moment that a payer creates a provider data report, it's out of date. Given the ever-changing nature of provider practices, market dynamics, demographic changes, consolidation, et cetera, how have payer clients expressed their goals of success, for example, metrics, otherwise, as a result of engaging a third-party partner?
It's a good question. I think there are a few different different lenses that we've heard clients articulate this goal. One is compliance. I'll come back to that one in a second. But the other ones are member experience and member satisfaction. Members get frustrated when the problems with their health plans network are obvious to them, and they can be obvious in different ways, right? A surprise bill, a lousy user experience on the website. They pick up the phone based on a phone number that's on the health plan's website, and it's disconnected. Those types of things, or payment and the lens of payment integrity. We're not able to automate our payments in an efficient way, and everything that kind of goes along with that. The compliance one I think is interesting because what matters maybe less is exactly what the rules are. What matters more is the trajectory of the rules. And I think this speaks to the vision of the future that I was laying out. So most health plans, everybody knows that this data gets out of date really fast. And most health plans are able to refresh their data, what, Jake? Monthly?
I would say monthly
Every
is
couple of
probably
weeks
average.
if they're doing really well.
Yeah.
Some have squeezed it down to a week or 72 hours. The government's now saying 48 hours. And tomorrow they're going to say 24 hours. And so exactly how we get there isn't quite clear, but I think that the endpoint is clear. Like we're being pushed from a regulatory perspective towards closer to real time. And that's inevitable to me. So when customers ask us these questions, I think we try to reframe the discussion a little bit around where the future is headed. If you're making investments that just help you comply with current regulations, you're gonna almost immediately be out of date yourself, because you need to be moving in a direction where you're going to ultimately be able to support real-time interaction with your data sources and almost real-time accountability for the data that you're presenting to your customers. So hopefully that speaks to the question. I don't know if it's a perfect answer, but it kind of lays out the vision that we have.
No, I think it really does address it. Just one thing to add there is one common complaint we get from clients is, our previous member experience. Well, not only from a UI standpoint, was it not effective at generating search results that we want, But when brokers are speaking with potential new members and they're looking for a provider who should be in that health plan's network, and the health plan itself knows that provider's in network, but for whatever reason, that data just wasn't updated on time to facilitate that real-time conversation with the member, between the member and the broker. So the broker's sitting there saying, hey, I know your doc is in network. I've talked to the contracts team, but I don't know why I can't find them in here. It's a frustrating situation for the broker, and it hampers growth for the plan. So that's one goal I did want to mention too, is, hey, we need this data to be updated as soon as we can, likely within that 48-hour rule, so that all the changes are reflected in the directory. And it's, not to belittle the member experience, somebody going out looking for a doctor, but also this broker experience looking for new members to join the plan. So while we're circling back on any new questions that filter in through the chat, David, I think a good place to land too, I think we'd be remiss not to cover the NDH that CMS is talking about. So this is the National Directory of Healthcare Providers that they were soliciting feedback on late last year. I think everybody and their uncle submitted a comment. So yeah, I'm just curious, where sort of as a policy expert, where you're seeing CMS align with these sort of automation conversations.
It remains to be seen how big a bite of this problem CMS may try to bite off. And it also remains to be seen, whether they can execute on whatever they bite off. I think it's going to create some really interesting questions if CMS does try to take a really big project on and produce what they think is an authoritative provider data resource. In some ways, it might undermine some of the other regulatory activity that's going on right now, because you could imagine a health plan saying, hey, if we just present our members with the data that CMS says is accurate, shouldn't we be given safe harbor from any of the consequences if it turns out to be bad? So I think there are a lot of reasons to be skeptical that that a big federal agency like CMS will be able to pull something off that really dramatically changes the nature of the problem here. That being said, even if they do, and if they do, that'd be great. So much of what makes provider data challenges so daunting is the business process oriented stuff that happens within an organization, right? And CMS is never going to touch that. So you still have these questions of context and provenance. Just because you have the most accurate representation of a provider and all of the locations where that provider may practice, let's say we get that magically from CMS, it doesn't mean that we have a process set up to communicate which of those locations is in network for certain services in a certain line of business, right?
That's right.
Like those types of things are sort of inside the walls of a health plan, and they're just such a huge dimension to these challenges that while I applaud anything that the government tries to do in this area, I think every health plan is still going to have those challenges and still going to be looking for technology that can help them operate more effectively and efficiently.
Well said. And I think if we don't have any other questions in the chat, that might be a good place to end. So I'll wait just a few moments here and see if anybody's typing one out and drops that in. But if not, we can probably, am I hearing a notification of that? Just hang out for one more second here. So it doesn't, oh, thanks, Rachel. That's what I heard. So if there's no more questions, we're happy to continue the dialogue. So please use the link in the chat, schedule a time to speak with one of our implementation specialists. Happy to be here for any questions you might have around data automation, selecting a vendor. Thanks so much for joining us today, everybody. Thank you, David, for joining us. Have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday indeed.